Absolutely. Thank you, Kate, so much. I, again, just really appreciate the opportunity to do this presentation and talk to you guys and answer any questions that might come up. So thank you for anyone who can make it to the live moment showing of this, and there will be the recording afterwards for anyone who's not able to make it at this time. So I'm going to do my presentation on spelling to communicate, and I will be referring to it as S2C. It's less of a mouthful. It's an overview of S2C, how it works, why it's important, and how to get involved. And just as a forewarning, I am going to use a lot of interchangeable terminology. So I might say people with autism or autistic people. I might say spellers, non-speakers, students. I do this when I'm speaking with a group or doing a presentation because I'm not sure of everyone's exact preference. Normally, if I'm just speaking with one person, I do tend to go with what their preference is. But for a presentation's sake, I kind of mix it up and just go with so thank you for understanding that. And if it causes any confusion, please let me know. And I also just wanted to let everyone know my slides are pretty dense. I'm just very excited to share everything with you. So you might have a bunch of questions. You can pop anything in the chat if you want, and I believe Kate will be able to monitor the chat. Otherwise, we've got time for questions at the end, and I will provide my contact information to you for any further communication or questions. So apologies for the density, but I am very enthusiastic about this. And here we go. Here's a picture of me. I will get off this screen pretty quickly. So who am I? I'm a certified S2C practitioner, and I am a communication and regulation partner, which is a CRP, and we will go into that a little bit further into the presentation. Otherwise, I'm also a Master of Social Work graduate student at ASU Tucson campus. I'm a graduate fellow in the Arizona LEND program, as well as a clinical intern at Casa de los Niños right now. I have generally a background in children and family services, behavioral therapy, and multiple experiential approaches. And just personally, I'm an animal lover, a nature lover. I'm very passionate and motivated, and I'd like to be an advocate who's ready to see change. So what is S2C? It is a methodology that teaches individuals with sensory motor challenges the purposeful motor skills to point to letters as an alternative means of communication. So the goal is really to achieve synchrony between the brain and the body, the brain-body connection, in order to elicit reliable and meaning communication. It emphasizes that communication is a human right, a universal human right, and no one should be denied access to communication. I will also be using terms like non-speaking as opposed to nonverbal. And I'd like to go into a description of this because nonverbal is really the most common word you hear when you're describing someone who does not speak. However, the distinction is that nonverbal, derived from Latin, actually means without words. And what we're finding is that that's an incorrect description of our students or spellers. They do, in fact, have many words going on inside of them. They simply do not have the speech to reliably or robustly communicate all these words. So nonverbal might imply the assumption that someone doesn't have the cognitive aspect of language when truly they do. So that's why I like to educate about the word non-speaking, which is more of an umbrella term for people who can't use speech as their primary, reliable, or effective communication. So non-speaking could mean someone who has little to no speech. They really don't use speech at all to communicate. There's also minimally speaking. So someone might have some speech, a little bit, but it may not be enough for robust and flexible conversation. This could look like someone requesting the bathroom or their favorite snack or their favorite TV show, but maybe they can't go into a full conversation about why that TV show is their favorite. And then finally, we've got unreliable speakers. So people who are unreliably speaking do have the ability to speak and use speech, but can't always access intentional planning with speech. So this might look like echolalia. I always mess that word up. Echolalia, where there's a lot of repetition or copying. Sometimes people repeat the same phrases over and over. So clearly they have the speech capability to make those sounds, but it's possible that they are not always intentional or directed. I also am going to talk about the difference of speech and language. So language, and let me move this thing on my screen real quick so I can actually see my full slide. There we go. Language is the ability to comprehend, understand, and formulate responses to communication. So communication can really be anything between two or more people. So thoughts, ideas, opinions, all that good stuff. Language is actually 100% cognitive. It's happening in our brain. One of the first areas, now this is of course a very simplified version of the brain, a very simplified diagram. I'm not a neuroscientist. So Wernicke's area is responsible for receptive language and language comprehension. So basically we're interpreting sounds and putting meaning to them. So it comes in and goes through this interpretation area. Now, Broca's area, which is over here, closer in the frontal lobe, is responsible for expressive language. Now, the first part of expressive language is to formulate your thoughts, ideas, opinions, responses, and that all happens in Broca's area. So both of these areas have actually shown to be intact with spellers. They are able to form their own thoughts, opinions, ideas without the otherwise expected mistakes in the language domains like semantics or syntax, phonology, morphology, the way that younger kids who are learning to speak make those mistakes. So attributing, using the word dog for all furry animals, or having different or kind of incorrect syntax. Spellers who are, of course, not at that age developmentally, aren't making those mistakes when they're spelling. So that kind of shows that these cognitive areas in the brain are functioning as intended. So then on the other hand, we've got speech, which is the ability to physically produce sounds. So therefore words and sentences. As we know, speech is really one of our most common forms of communication, and it does involve 100% motor skills. So it does use Broca's area in the brain to formulate those thoughts, ideas, opinions, responses, and start expressing them. But it has to be paired with our physical production of our voice, articulation, prosody, everything that goes along with the physical construction of speech. So what we're finding is non-speakers often have an output issue, so an issue with their speech, and not an input issue, which might be with their cognition or their language. So instead of treating non-speakers as if they have cognitive or behavioral issues, there's a new perspective, and that's what I'm so passionate about sharing and educating about. So thinking about the inability to communicate or control one's body can be looked at from a sensory motor differences perspective. And I'm going to go into some more details about that. So sensory motor in the brain. Now, like I said before, the diagrams I have are simplified versions of a very complex system we have. But I am such a visual learner. I like having visuals to accompany what I'm talking about. So in this first one, you'll notice we've got our motor cortex and our sensory cortex. Again, it's very simplified, but they run parallel right alongside each other, showing that we have a very strong relationship between our senses and our motor. One of the first examples that comes to mind is if you reach out and touch something hot, your senses are going to immediately tell your motor to pull back before you burn yourself. That's a very simple answer. It can obviously get way more complex. But over here on the right, we've got the depiction of our motor cortex kind of close up. This image is the homunculus drawing, which is supposed to represent our motor cortex, because about 75% of the motor cortex, or the brain power, as I like to call it here, is dedicated to our articulators. So that's the mouth or the lips or the tongue. It's also fingers, hands, and toes. All of these we might know as fine motor skills. Fine motor skills are complex, they're fast acting, and they require very detailed planning and coordination. On the other hand, only about 25% of the motor cortex is dedicated to gross motor movements, so kind of the rest of what's going on. This could be movement in our hips, our arms, knees, elbows, shoulders, the list could go on. These areas are a bit slower and they're less precise. So they're taking up a little bit less of that brain power, I like to call it. If you think about trying to point to something with your elbow as opposed to your finger, it's probably going to be less precise than if you use a finger to point to something. So it's just showing that the gross motor movements take up a little bit less of that complexity in the brain. So much of our everyday communication requires these complex fine motor demands, whether it's talking, writing, typing with both hands and most of your fingers. What S2C does is it stops putting the demand of communication on these complex fine motor articulators and instead starts to use gross motor movements to achieve communication. And it doesn't work like magic. It takes practice and building muscle memory. But the goal of S2C is to focus on the gross motor movements of arm movements, where you're reaching out and poking or touching a letter, so that your brain isn't having to put as much effort into lips, tongue, jaw, face, all those fine motor complexities. One. So there's multiple types of motor, and I will go into why this is important to know, but first just laying out the types of motor. So we've got reflexive motor, which is what I was kind of just talking about. So it's unplanned. So that means it's non-thinking, non-cognitive, and it happens subcortically, so low down in our brain, in actually our brainstem and our spinal cord, because it is a protective type of motor and it's really meant for survival purposes. So what I was talking about with reaching a hand out, getting the sense that something is too hot and quickly pulling it away, that's an example of a reflexive motor movement. So it's often in response to very specific stimuli, again, meant for protection and survival. Impulsive motor is another type of motor that's unplanned. So again, it's not cognitive or involves much thinking. It's also subcortical, but this time it functions in the amygdala and the limbic system. So these are kind of the emotion centers of the brain. And it's really impulses are in response to basic drives like hunger, thirst, sleep, safety, sex, fear. And it could also be in response to strong internal emotions. When these impulses are triggered often, they can easily become what we call overlearned or overpracticed and turn into automatic motor, which is when we see a lot of those repetitive motor things happening, like grabbing things, hitting, running away. It's possible that it served an impulsive purpose at one point and has just become automatic. So really anything can become automatic with enough repetition. And that's where S2C comes in. So I've highlighted purposeful movement or purposeful motor over here. And purposeful motor is really what we aim to teach in S2C. So it's controlled in that frontal lobe region, so the higher brain thinking, where it requires a lot of planning, cognitive thinking, control, and it's basically the use of praxis, or it is praxis. So ideally, we want purposeful movement to become automatic. So if you think about in probably your life, I'm not sure if you remember learning how to walk, but if you remember learning how to drive a car, and in this case with spelling, learning how to point to letters. At first, it starts off as very purposeful. You have to think about every little thing. What are my feet doing? What are my hands doing? Where am I going? What are my eyes doing? Eventually, driving a car in this example becomes automatic for a lot of people. I don't know about you guys, but I have many times gone on autopilot while driving and accidentally driven to work when really I was supposed to be going to a friend's house or somewhere else, because driving has become so automatic that I can tune it out to an extent. So ideally, we would like the actual movement of poking and pointing to letters to become automatic so that people can put less focus and energy on the motor demand and can therefore put more effort and energy into what they are communicating, the substance of it. So again, sometimes that impulsive action, the impulsive motor can become automatic. And what we call a lot of the repetitive behaviors are loops. So if you hear me say loops, it could be anything. There are vocal loops, there are physical loops. So that's kind of what that means. So why does this matter? So keeping these in mind, S2C's goal is really to interrupt or pause the impulses that have become automatic so that we can make space for this purposeful motor practice. So with purposeful motor practice, the stronger and stronger these pathways in our brain or the connections in our brain become, it makes them easier to access and easier to use. So again, it could happen with impulses, but we can also have it happen with something more productive and functional like spelling. So you've heard me mention praxis, and when I first heard that word, I wasn't familiar with what it meant. So in terms of speech and motor, it's really the ability to execute chains of smooth motor movement. So internally, you make a plan, you initiate the plan, you execute the plan, and then you respond with your senses, and it can continue going. Apraxia, which is often used interchangeably with dyspraxia, is really a breakdown in praxis. So there's a difficulty in execution, coordination, or initiation of motor movements. And we oftentimes call it the brain-body disconnect. But apraxia does not mean that there is low intelligence or necessarily that there's physical disability or weakness. While that could happen just separately on its own, that's not what apraxia is referring to. So approximately 2/3 of people with autism have some form of apraxia or dyspraxia. Of course, it's in varying degrees of intensity, but as we all are possibly aware that there are people who are non-speaking who are on the autism spectrum, and that's, they fall into this 2/3. And surprisingly to me, before I learned this, almost 98% of people with Down syndrome have apraxia or motor speech disorders. And that is a much bigger percent than I would have guessed. So with all of this information, and I know I'm just running through things, I can't wait for questions. Presuming competence is my number one thing that I say. It means to assume that someone is cognitively present inside, even if they're not showing it, and that they are able and willing to learn. Presuming competence does not mean that I'm assuming someone is a genius, because if someone's never been exposed to something or never learned something, that would be an unfair assumption. The presumption is that they are able and willing. So this looks like treating someone age appropriately, no matter their speaking ability or really their motor control ability. It looks like treating someone in ways that will make them feel valued, capable, and respected. So it's really a shift away from assuming that those who are non-speaking are also cognitively delayed. We are presuming competence. The reason why this is really new to people is a lot of testing that happens, whether it's academic, behavioral, communication, functional, it requires motor control. So when people have been given tests, they maybe have never received support from a sensory motor perspective. So they struggle with a lot of these forms of testing and are therefore unable to show the extent of their competence, just because of these difficulties, and also sometimes the lack of motor support provided just in their daily lives. So presuming competence is the least dangerous assumption you can make about someone. So this is kind of how I break it down. If I presume competence in someone and I turn out to be wrong, the biggest danger or risk is that I'm over teaching them. I'm exposing them to more information than necessary. However, if I presume incompetence, if I presume that someone is not in there and I turn out to be wrong, the danger is a little bit more dire. It's neglect or not teaching them. So my question is, which one is the bigger, more dangerous or harmful risk? And which one would you rather take with a loved one? So with all of that, I kind of want to go into what are S2C sessions like? What do they look like? With some of the resources I give you, there will be multiple videos to watch. You can always look up stuff like that. So I actually don't have any videos to show today. My fear of technical difficulties is strong. But basically, spellers go through a series or a hierarchy of letter boards that start with the easiest and the least demanding on the motor skills. And then they move to more advanced motor intensive boards. And I'll show you pictures of these in a minute. So it starts off with 3 boards. So the alphabet is actually split up across a set of 3 boards. They can either be stencils, where you're poking a pencil through the stencil letter, or sensory boards, which have foam letters that pop out. The point of both of these is that they give concrete sensory feedback to the speller when they're selecting a letter. And also, this is accompanied by a number board with the same setup. Once someone is using the 3 boards very smoothly and accurately, we bump up sort of to the next level, for lack of a better term, to a 26-letter board. So the alphabet is all on one board, so it's visually more stimulating and sometimes more overwhelming. It can also be more demanding on the motor because there's a lot more to choose from. But this can still either be on a stencil board or a sensory board for that sensory feedback. Also, again, there's a number board with it. Finally, or not finally, but the next bump up level is a laminate board. So it's a laminated page with the entire alphabet, basic punctuation, numbers, symbols, all that good stuff. But on the laminated board, there's no texture or obvious sensory feedback. So this makes it the more advanced option in terms of motor demand, because there's none of that, none of those feelings when you're touching a letter or poking a letter. So you really kind of work up to the laminate board. And then some spellers decide to move on to typing on a keyboard, which is a whole new task because the letters are oriented differently, and they're very small on a keyboard oftentimes. And the feedback of pushing a button is different from some of the feedback that they've gotten from other boards. But lots of spellers have decided that they would like to move on to a keyboard, put a lot of effort into learning that. And oftentimes it's just using one finger or sometimes 2. It's not the type of typing where you're using all of your fingers. So all of this, I want to emphasize that spelling fluently and openly does not happen overnight. I wish it could, but it's a process that can really take time and patience and lots of effort, both for the CRP and the speller. So I like to compare it to learning how to play the piano. You could comprehend how to read music. You could comprehend what key makes what sound, but you're not going to sit down and all of a sudden play the most complex piece because you don't have that muscle memory. You don't have the motor skills yet. You have to take time to build up that muscle memory and the learning of how to play all these concepts before you start playing something like Beethoven or Mozart. So here are pictures of a bunch of letter boards. There are some that look different. I just picked a handful. But these guys over here, you can't really see it clearly in the pictures, but they are the sensory boards. So they have the foam letters that pop out. And again, they come in the small 3 size and the bigger 26 size. These two here are the laminated boards. Again, it's hard to tell the texture differences in a picture. But over here, the stencil, you can clearly see why it's called the stencil. And if you have a pencil, a pen, a chopstick, whatever it may be, poking through that blank space is really good sensory feedback, especially when you're first starting to spell. So also in sessions, we use something called lessons. So lessons are age-appropriate materials that we basically use as a vehicle to practice spelling together. So they're meaningful, intelligent, and respectful, basically conversations, we try to make it, surrounding new, interesting, and frequently educational material, which really is meant to facilitate discussion, learning, and mainly engaging both someone's brain and body during the spelling process. So this could be, you're reading a lesson about math, a math subject, or it could be reading about your favorite baseball team or your favorite rapper. It could be anything as long as it's interesting and you've got chunks of information. So it's basically paragraphs. And then you've got keywords within those paragraphs. So words that the practitioner will spell out loud and frequently write it out while reading the lesson. And the purpose of this is because they might be important words in the lesson, but they also might be words that have unusual spelling or words that maybe the speller has never come across before, or maybe the practitioner, thinks it would be a new word to the speller. So when in doubt, spell it out. Keywords are very useful, and sometimes it's a great reminder, even if you're spelling a word that you think someone probably knows how to spell, it's a good reminder anyways. It doesn't hurt anything. Within lessons, there are various types of questions. And again, it's kind of levels of questions. So there's spell words, there's known questions, there's number and math questions, there's semi-open questions and prior knowledge questions, there's open-ended questions, creative writing questions, and then one of my favorites is VACT activities. So different activities that involve the body that you can add in that might involve something visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or tactile. So I've got an example of a little lesson chunk of a lesson, probably 10 to 12 chunks of information like this. This is one that was on the construction of the Hoover Dam. Very interesting lesson. I learned so much from lessons. It's amazing. And I write them myself too. So it's an educational experience for everyone. In green, we've got spell words that are directly from the text. So they're the easiest level cognitively. And then we've got green questions that are known questions. So also just straight from the text. These orange guys are the semi-open. So there's either multiple ways of phrasing the question or multiple possible answers. And the blue ones are prior knowledge questions. So asking something that's related to the lesson, but maybe isn't directly from it, that would be from prior knowledge. And then there's math and number questions. So this one just has one, but it could get complex the more you get into the math ones. And then VACT is watching this YouTube video. And then in pink, we've got this open-ended question of what do you think about the high scalers' makeshift hard hats, which leaves it open for someone's opinions and thoughts. So the cognitive motor seesaw, it's a great image to have. So on one end, you've got cognitive, and on the other end, you've got motor. And during the acquisition phase, or even times of dysregulation or just change, it's best to toggle with the balance of the cognitive demands and the motor demands. So if you increase the cognitive, like you're bumping up a level in questions, then you might decrease the level of board. So maybe you're typically spelling on the laminate, but you decrease to one of the sensory or stencil boards just to help balance that out a little bit. And again, that's just initially, and then eventually you flow everything together and it becomes more second nature. So there's also prompting that happens, especially in the acquisition phase. So the acquisition phase being where someone is learning about the motor skills, they're really getting the practice in. Prompting is very encouraged during this time because it coaches the motor. Prompts are not really directed at the mind or the cognitive processes. It's more the direction of the body itself. Prompting can also keep the student focused and help them tune out a lot of competing or distracting stimuli. So this stimuli can be external or internal, but if you are also giving them some stimuli to focus on, it can help them tune out whatever else is going on, and they can focus on what's happening right here in front of them. And my favorite part is that prompting provides a feedback loop for spelling. So it reflects on what the student's body is doing or what it needs to be doing. And I compare it to the way a red squiggly line on a Word document, or autocorrect on our phones gives us feedback about how or what we are spelling. So those are really considered prompts of, hey, you misspelled something, you got to go back and fix it. So prompting can kind of provide the same type of support for a speller, especially when they're getting into more open communication, yet they are not on a keyboard and don't have a screen in front of them to reference. So oftentimes I will say the letter out loud of what someone has poked, so they know Anna said A. Okay, I know my finger went to the A. I'm going to move on to the next letter. So within the acquisition phase, we've got corrective prompting. And again, this is to be faded back before moving on to more complex spelling. They're systematically faded, really. So it's directional cues. So giving feedback if someone is hitting a letter that's too high up or too down low. Sometimes we use the phrases like, it's just upstairs or just downstairs, or it's next door to where you are. And then gestural cues are honestly what I've been doing with my hands a lot, but gesturing to where a letter might be. So if someone is first starting out, I might be doing a very specific pointing at the letter so that their eyes go there and their finger goes there, or their pen, whatever it is. This can quickly be faded back and gets to a point where you're kind of waving a vague direction towards the letter as a way of fading it. And then eventually you're not gesturing at all. And they're got that focus, they've got the practice in. So then there can be some ongoing prompting that give feedback to spellers about their body, their movements, their eyes, so that they can be aware of their body and space. So there's initiation prompts, like I said, when discussing praxis and apraxia. Initiation can be extremely hard for someone with these sensory motor difficulties. So even just saying like, okay, ready, 1, 2, 3, go for it, start now, or get straight to it, can really just kick their system into gear. There's also continuation prompts. So I mentioned I say the letter when someone hits it. In addition to that, kind of keeping a flow and a prosody and a rhythm to it. Oftentimes you can say and or then in between letters, or keep going, keep moving. And it sounds funny at first, but you might hear a practitioner say P and, R and, O and, get it, T and. So really keeping that prosody helps the flow and helps the regulation. And then there's eye prompts, so cues for eye movement. So ocular motor control can be extremely challenging for spellers. So lots of eye reminders, even if it's just, hey, your eyes are closed, open your eyes and get them on the board, or bring your eyes back to the board, look over here, so that it's really a reminder for them to realize where their eyes are and where their eyes need to be. And I said I would talk about the CRP. So the CRP is crucial. That is the communication and regulation partner, the person who is spelling, who is with the speller. And if you think about it like a dance partner, you have to get used to each other's flow, but once you do it, it can be wonderful. So same thing with a CRP. So you form this trusting, close relationship, this close bond, and it really helps build these skills for communication. The CRP holds the board for the speller at an appropriate eye and arm level to diminish any extra motor demands, whether it's ocular or physical. So you don't want someone reaching super high, but you also don't want someone having to look down, because that can be a strain on the eyes. Some spellers do get to a place where they can spell with a keyboard with no one holding it, but not everyone does and not everyone wants to. Luckily, people at that point are able to express what they want to do or don't want to do. The CRP, again, provides prompting, feedback, encouragement, but really the most important part of being a CRP is that R in the middle. We are regulation partners. So regulation is so important. It involves a lot of co-regulation in these sessions. And if a speller becomes dysregulated for whatever reason, helping them come back to a more calm and collected state, helping them re-regulate themselves. And this can take a lot of practice and patience for both the speller and the CRP. But because dysregulation can be extremely disruptive to a speller's body, mind, their senses, their motor control, having someone to help co-regulate is really crucial to the process of spelling. Even just reminding them like, hey, you're walking in circles right now. Come here, let's finish this sentence. So why isn't everyone talking about S2C? I'm talking about S2C all the time. But it's a new concept. New ideas do take time to make their way into the mainstream. It does challenge much of what we thought we knew about autism and non-speakers. What I was trained was not this originally. And also research is slow. It requires a lot of funding, time, effort, willing participants, all that good stuff. And because regulation, like I was saying, is so crucial for speller success, many spellers and their families have decided that they're not interested in subjecting themselves to the dysregulation that research can cause. So it's a strange environment. There's strangers who are closely observing you. They have this task of having to prove themselves that they're a person. Many people have opted out of doing this, but there is good news. There's some ongoing and existing research that's available to read about, and I will give you that resource at the end of this presentation, but it's at iask.org. Also, I've been talking about S2C this whole time because that's what I'm trained in. That's my area of expertise. There are other methods, so Speller's method and rapid prompting method, or RPM. All of them have the same goal of helping someone spell and get reliable communication and autonomy in their communication. I do not have the training in the other two, but I know that they are pretty similar in their goals and a lot of the methods. So getting involved, my first resource that I always give is the International Association for Spelling as Communication. So www.i-asc.org. So I call it IASC. They've got everything from basic information, getting started, but they've got research, they've got blog posts by both spellers and professionals. They have a huge emphasis on advocacy. They have lots of events, webinars, learning opportunities, community gatherings, things like that. So amazing resource. There's so much. You could spend all day poking around on that website. Also, reading the book Underestimated, An Autism Miracle. It's written by JB and Jamie Hanley. So JB is Jamie's father, and it's about their journey of going through spelling to communicate. And Jamie co-authors the book with him. Watching the movie Spellers, if you haven't already, I know I've already discussed this with some people here, on Kinema streaming, so it's just kinema.com, and it is such an inspirational, amazing movie. The people who are a part of the movie are incredible, and it's just made a huge impact. It actually won Best Documentary at the Phoenix Film Festival. It is so well done and incredible. Last, but doesn't have to be last, send me an email. My email is just spellingwithanna@gmail.com, and I would be happy to point you in the right direction of getting started or figuring out spelling sessions, what works for you guys. Or if you want to become a certified practitioner yourself, I'd also be thrilled to provide support in that, because the more the merrier. So takeaways: presume competence. Always trust that a student can and wants to learn. And keep in mind, I wasn't able to fully emphasize this, but this is one of my go-to slogans, is listening does not have a look. Most non-speakers don't have the traditional look of that they're listening. Their bodies might move differently. They might make noise, cover their ears. They might run away. But trust that they are listening, and they have been listening this whole time. They don't have to have that traditional sitting still and looking in your direction in order to absorb what is going on. They are highly absorbent people. They've been taking it all in this whole time. So with that is feed the brain. So even if you're a non-speaker, your speller, whoever it is watching their favorite TV show, or they've got their headphones on and their face in a blanket, Expose them to age-appropriate content. This could be movies, books, podcasts, community outings, really anything. Assume that they do not always want to be engaged in their loops. Their bodies don't always reflect how they're feeling. So exposing them to this brain food, as I call it, it doesn't have to be a battle. Just play that podcast in the background while they're watching their favorite show, or just set something out that they could look at whenever their body gets to it. And coaching the motor. So break down directions into motor tasks. So instead of saying something vague, which we take it for granted, it doesn't seem vague to me, like come over here, make it very specific and motor coaching. So break it down, push on your feet to stand up, push into the floor, turn your body in my direction, walk in my direction, 1 foot at a time, 1 foot in front of the other. And this is a very simple example, but you can do this with anything and really think about all the muscles that are involved in a seemingly simple movement that might not be simple for someone who has sensory motor differences. And just get that practice of purposeful motor movement in everyday life. It's not just spelling. It can be anything from cleaning up their dishes, to taking the dog for a walk, to watering plants. I mean, really anything can be purposeful to get them out of those loops. And here's some resources, and I'm going to get these to you guys so you don't have to jot them down super quick or try and memorize them. But one thing I do want to bring attention to is kind of some of the online communities that exist. So I know Facebook groups that exist. There's Spellers Community, Arizona or AZ Spellers, and Tucson Spellers are all groups of like-minded people, families, spellers themselves. And then also following iAsk and Speller's Method on social media, subscribing to their newsletters. There's a lot you could tap into. But all of these will be available to you guys. You can refer back to them. And I've got some references for what I used for my PowerPoint. And I am going to stop sharing here so that I can see some faces. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry I ran through that so quickly, but there's so much information. And again, I'm happy to provide anything further. But with these last 10, 15 minutes, if there's any questions anyone wants to ask that came up, I'd be happy to answer whatever I can.
That was awesome, Anna. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to put stuff in the chat, they can, or if you want to come off mute, that's okay too. Either way.
I had a question. My name is Marcus. Thanks for the presentation, Anna.
Yeah.
One question I had was, what would be an example of an age-appropriate, just, I don't know what you call it, like a distraction to get them out of loops for 16, 17-year-old?
Yeah. So I don't always think it's going to work to get someone out of loops. You might even be able to expose them to age-appropriate information even while they're in a loop. If they're running in circles, or it seems like they're running to a different room and maybe they're not interested, still just do the thing. So I like to think of, in these situations, podcasts. So podcasts for, especially for older teenagers, really could be an array of things. Whether it's about something educational or pop culture. Obviously, I recommend vetting podcasts to make sure they are actually appropriate and not using language that you don't want to hear, and stuff like that. But I know just podcasts have really exploded and there's so many options. So even if it's something you're also interested in, I bet you your child would be interested to learn along with you, even if their body isn't entirely showing that. Now, sometimes loops can be easier to break. So I'm sure people can picture times where it's very hard to get someone to stop doing something, and sometimes they seem more easily distracted, whether it's the type of loop that they're involved in, if it's super deep-seated or it's just superficial, or if it's just different moods, different days. People have hard days and not as hard days. So if you do have the opportunity to really interrupt loops, someone could look at a book with you. And again, for a 16-year-old, this would be a chapter book, could be educational nonfiction, or it could just be a really great fiction novel. They can look at it with you. You can read it out loud. Some people don't always have time to read long books out loud, but if you do, that's wonderful. That's the beauty of podcasts. You can just click play. And doing things that maybe you would think, oh, I never thought my son would be interested in this. Just try it, because if they start spelling with you and communicating like, hey, that was awesome that you made me do that, however many years ago, it could be really cool. And again, you're not forcing things, you're not creating a battle, you're not causing more issues than necessary. But on those days where the loops are easier to interrupt, kind of interjecting where you can. Yeah, and just exploring that age appropriate content, like 16, 17, you got lots to work with there.
I kind of have a question, Anna.
Yeah.
So under non-speaking, I think you had minimally speaking for people who can maybe say yes or no, but they're not like discussing. Where would you fit spelling into there, or would you, because this was kind of leading into my next question, which is they have some sort of motor access of being able to say yes, no, YouTube, but where do you start to like push spelling into like whole sentences, or versus pushing communication verbally into whole sentences? And is there an age difference in which you would do that? Because so my son is 7, so.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it can be really confusing. So with apraxia, with these issues, it's not that someone has a physical issue, like they're unable to produce sounds in terms of their physical mouth or tongue or whatever it is. It's actually the connection. So it's the planning process from the brain, from the cognition. Somehow there's a disconnect between that and being able to get it out. So even if someone is able to enunciate some vocal sounds, YouTube, bathroom, whatever it is, unless someone communicates to me that they want to work on spelling, which we will get to, I have come to that point with multiple people. I focus on spelling because, again, it is that gross motor control. So it's way simpler to teach someone to communicate full sentences with spelling than it is to try and get them to communicate complex sentences with very limited speech. Just because, again, it's not a physical thing, it's not a mental thing, it's that disconnect in terms of the planning and the execution. So age-wise, 7 is a wonderful time to spell. Really, I ask, the International Association recommends that you can start as early as 4. Again, that would look really different than spelling with someone who's 17 or 25 or whatever, because you are treating them at an age-appropriate level. So you will be going through really simple learning material with them where they're learning to spell, they're learning how language works. But if someone is older, they've been through a lot of that. Even if they weren't specifically taught, hey, this is how you spell this, or this is how this part of language works, they've been exposed to all of this their whole life, and they've been absorbing it their whole life. So the age difference, really the only thing that comes into play is how you are, I guess, treating them and what you're exposing them to. And with any age, once you get to that level of open communication and fluency, which again does not happen overnight, it takes patience and effort. You can ask someone and say, are you interested in working on your speech? Do you want to practice that? Because it's hard, it's effort, it's tough. Some people are really motivated and they want to. And some people are like, I've got spelling, I don't need to put that effort in. I've got my effort right here. So it really depends on the individual, but that's a really good question.
One more question, because
Yeah.
it's kind of a similar topic. So I know with like ACC devices or AAC devices, often depending on the person individually, they might start there and then they develop speech and then they don't need it anymore. How often do you see or do you know any research of people who start spelling, start practicing and practicing all of those motor physical hand ones and then move to verbal speech? Or does that happen?
So, in terms of research, I don't know of anything just because this is a pretty new area. So, research is slowly happening, but again, that all takes time. So, I'm sure in the near future, there will probably be research about that. But currently, right now, I'm not aware of anything like that. So, I have no idea what, in terms of a percentage or number of people who really do that. And I know some people who do a mixture. They will use speech functionally for day-to-day little things like, we got to go outside, like it's hot in here, things like that. But if they're communicating these complex thoughts like, wow, it's so hot in here because the sun's rays are shining through the window, and when UV hits the window, like, I'm just coming up with a weird example, but that some people will use spelling for. So some people that I know personally and that I've seen will toggle between the two. So I'm not sure in terms of number of people, but bringing up the AAC is great because people ask me about that all the time. Is this like AAC? And it is, but it's not. So AAC requires poking, hitting buttons, and it communicates a lot of functional things. I need to go to the bathroom. This is the food I want. This is what I need right now, all that good stuff. What happens with AAC, because there's not an emphasis on the motor coaching and the regulation, the co-regulation, some people will start looping with an AAC. So I don't know if you know anyone like this. I have interacted with a few people like this who have an AAC device and they will hit cookies over and over and over and over again. Because while they were learning AAC, they got that sugary treat. And that we all know is addictive. So that's going to become an impulse real quick unless someone is coaching them through it to really functionally use it. And then another thing with AAC is it's better than nothing. I think they can be very functional, but it does kind of box people in sometimes. So if you imagine internally, you're like, I really want a hamburger with tomato, but no onion. And you go onto your AAC device and maybe you've got hot dog, chips, cookies, spaghetti, taco, whatever it is. There's no hamburger on that list. Not only can you specify that you don't want onion, but you can't even specify that you want a hamburger. So you might pick the closest thing. You might hit hot dog. And okay, that's functional. You're getting fed something that maybe you like, but it's not the autonomy of being your own person. So the ability of, and oddly enough, the simplicity of 26 letters can open up anything that anyone needs to say or wants to say. So it's really that next step. So a lot of people who have started with AAC are doing great with spelling because they've gotten some of that motor movement down. But yes, you have great questions.
Thank you for answering them.
This is Penny Simpson. I'm Stuart's mom. Anna started working with Stuart about 2 weeks ago. I was wondering if it's typical to see like continuous improvement, more linear improvement, or if there's a little bit of a period where you don't see a lot and then all of a sudden there's a big gain.
Great question. I'm going to generally say it really depends on the individual. Some people, I myself can have a great week and then a not great week, and things can really fluctuate. I'm sure a lot of people can relate. Typically, I see small rises and dips with the people that I'm working with. Sometimes there's a really big, huge, wonderful thing that happens. And then I'll come back another day and they are not having it. And they're not in the mood, or it's maybe not even mood. It's their body is dysregulated and it's hard to work with. So a lot of times it's not the cognitive aspect. Again, it's the getting someone to use their body purposefully. So some days I can walk in and someone will come and sit right next to me and we're having a grand time and we're pals. And another day I walk in and maybe they're having a rough day. It was a bad day at school, or they're hungry, their head hurts, and they haven't been able to get what they need. And they might be all over the place. They're running away, they're yelling, not because they don't want to work on their communication, but because their body is dysregulated. It needs something. So again, that's not quite in terms of whether it's linear progress or not progress. It's just the day-to-day differences in body regulation, in internal mood, and also motivation. I mean, you think about a 16-year-old, this is hard work. And if I come in and I'm like, hey, we're going to put in a lot of effort today, yes, they're probably, wanting to do that. But if I think about myself as a 16-year-old, there were also times that I wanted to just lay on the couch and do nothing. So I have to keep in mind, these guys are not always perfectly wanting to be fully motivated and do everything great. They're a lot of times humans, they're kids, they have moods. So there is a lot of fluctuation. In general, I tend to see a steady increase in skills. In general, again, depends on the individual, how many sessions they do, and if they're getting practice outside of sessions. So when I see the most growth is when someone has maybe a once or twice a week session with me, but their parent or caregiver or teacher or whoever it is practicing spelling with them on all the other days that I'm not there. So I typically do a 1 hour session-ish. It's around an hour, maybe a little over. And parents can do 20 minutes a day. They could do 10 minutes. They could do 30 minutes, 45. They can do however much they want. But really, it's all about the practice, the muscle memory. So that's really where I can see some big increases, which is awesome.
Okay. Does it need to be the same person? Like, I think that we would like our teacher and his caregiver both to work with him.
Yeah, so, and I was talking to Melissa about that. My kind of way that I do it is I get to know a speller first for a little bit, just myself and them spelling. So I get to know how their body works and what to look for if there's any dysregulation, stuff like that. And just getting them in the flow of spelling with someone who's been trained and has been doing it. And then after just a little while, I start moving into coaching, whether it's a parent, a caregiver, a teacher. So I told Melissa, shortly, as if she's interested, I would like to get her on the boards with him and start giving her coaching about it so that she can start practicing. And again, it's not going to be perfect in the beginning. It never is. She can start practicing if she wants to. And then if you've got someone else, whether it's you or his caregiver or dad, anyone, same thing. It would be multiple coaching sessions with me. And I've even had people send me videos if we can't do an in-person session with the parent. I've had parents just record small chunks and I can give them feedback based on a video. So there's lots of ways to go through the training, but yes, a couple spellers have multiple people. Some spellers just have one and that works great, but it's great to have a variety of people who are involved and trained and available.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any more questions? Cool. Thank you so very much, Anna. This was so incredibly informative and wonderful. It was just great to see all the stuff laid out there. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to stop the